Now, the Reserve Bank of Australia, after a dozen interest rate rises under the Albanese government, they themselves have said that at the last meeting they were more likely to put them up than put them down. They ended up holding and holding just. But as we've talked about ever since the last election, one interest rate rise was apparently a sign of a cost of living crisis that was out of control and the former Prime Minister had to go. Well, what do you say when there's been 12 more of them under your watch? Well, of course, Jim Chalmers has an answer to all of this, which is to change the Reserve Bank so it doesn't make the decisions that the government doesn't want them to make or becomes politically difficult. The python, of course, that is around Australians when it comes to trying to pay off their own homes or cost of living in general or rent that goes up as a result of the person trying to pay off the house of which you are renting. Well, it is now so tight around people's necks that, as I often say, people, they're not just bright red, they're not purple, they're like Ribena purple with how much pressure they're on. But Jim Chalmers has a plan. He wants to put a law through the Parliament that will change the way the Reserve Bank works. Firstly, the current group of people who are making the decisions, which clearly are about trying to get inflation in this country down to between 2 and 3%, despite the fact that inflation remains closer to 4% in this country rather than 3%, while in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, all of their inflation is lower than ours. But nothing to see here, right? The government, of course, then turns around and spends billions and billions and billions of extra dollars that they didn't spend before, but then they say it won't be inflationary. But then our inflation rate is higher than the rest of the world. Nothing to see here, of course. So the first thing they did was, after appointing their own version of the Reserve Bank boss, that now being Michelle Bullock, to replace the previous one, because remember, he was moustache twirling and monocle owning and he didn't care. Oh, that's right, he just was trying to return the country to the agreed rate of inflation. She also now has to give press conferences after the decisions are made, because, of course, she will be therefore held responsible, not the government, and they don't meet every month, they meet every 6 weeks or so. But the law that Chalmers wants to put in place is to take the current group of people who are making those decisions, the Reserve Bank board, and create an entirely separate group of people who are not connected to the board to make the decisions about interest rates. Among those, they would like to put on that board union members. People who would, put simply, not represent workers, but do the bidding of the government in the independent Reserve Bank. Now, the Greens believe that this really isn't necessary because they think that the current laws should be actually beefed up, meaning that the current Treasurer would be able to overrule the Reserve Bank. But today we learnt that the Liberal Party won't be having this. They'll do a deal on aged care, but they won't do a deal on changing, or dare I say, rigging the Reserve Bank. Jane Hume on Channel 2 today.
Maintaining stability and continuity on that board is fundamental for fighting inflation, and that should be the government's #1 priority. That was the government's sticking point. Now, bizarrely, the Treasurer then went into war with the RBA and essentially tried to undermine their independence, which we found very confronting. We're comfortable with the board that we have that are dealing with monetary policy as they are. That's the best way to get inflation down, which should be the #1 priority.
Correct, and remember, the majority of Australians, polled even by left-wing organisations, shows that the majority of Australians blame the federal government and the Treasurer for the issues to do with cost of living, not the Reserve Bank, the pre-rigged Reserve Bank. For his part, again, Jim Chalmers about why he wants to change the Reserve Bank.
I think you can imagine a situation where there has been some substantial structural or institutional failure or some kind of other emergency around perhaps the personnel of the Reserve Bank and its board or something like that, some total breakdown in the usual kind of decision-making capacity of the Reserve Bank. But we're very deliberately not stipulating the exact circumstances. We're trying to limit the circumstances.
But hang on, there's no evidence of any of that. Yes, they had an inquiry, which of course suggested, guess what, you should change the bank and be able to have more representative voices like unions on it. But there's no example of it being a failed institution in terms of how it does what it does. You can disagree with its decisions, fine, that's a democracy. But this is a bloke who is just literally trying to nobble the Reserve Bank from making the independent decisions to bring inflation down. inflation that in part still remains high because of the decisions of this federal government. I mentioned the Greens before. Now remember, most likely after the next election it's a minority government and the Greens are the tail that's wagging the dog.
They have the power, and it's there for a reason. It's there because in emergencies and in crises, and we're saying that people are at breaking point and are in a crisis now, in the middle of a cost of living and inequality crisis, Labor's saying they want to take their hands off the steering wheel even more, and we're saying no, that's not the answer.
So what's the Prime Minister going to do about this? Well, not much this week. You see, he's got more important things to do. Now, normally the Prime Minister passes himself off as one of us by walking around building sites, pointing at things, high-vis, but the other guy was all about photo ops. Yeah, OK. Pot calling kettle. We all know what Albo really likes to do, which is to get on one of two brand new private planes that his government have paid for and delivered. Yes, originally ordered by the previous government. But, geez, isn't it inconvenient to cancel a brand new plane? Because I like flying around the world on my own private plane that I even nickname after my dog. So guess what? Airbus Albo this week back up in the air where he loves to be, just looking at clouds. That was a real grab. Remember we showed you that? He's off to the United States. He's going to be there for a meeting of the Quad leaders. That, of course, is, among others, Australia, the United States, India, that are there. It means we'll get the opportunity of seeing a couple of losers together, this time Joe Biden and, in my view, Anthony Albanese. But we'll all wait and see. Now, no doubt there'll probably be a little side meeting with Kamala Harris. No conversation at all when it comes to Trump, but I'll get to that in a moment or two's time. But good to know, right? He will be up in the air again where he loves to be, on a plane that he nicknames after his dog, sitting with a president who is a lame duck president, who does not even have the strength to run for re-election, let alone to actually remain the president, because, of course, as we know, he spends more time at the beach than he does actually talking about global affairs. But also worth noting about global affairs is the latest escalation of the Ukraine war. Now, for anyone who's half listening, I'm not somebody who believes that the Ukraine war is a hopeless fight that no one should be involved in for obvious reasons. One's a democracy, Russia ain't. And for obvious reasons, Ukraine should do everything it can to try to repel Russia. But there's been a change in the past couple of weeks that maybe you haven't noticed because there's a lot of other things going on. And it is now a scenario where, as you know, the United States can't fight with Russia because if they fight with Russia directly, well, of course, Russia has a deal with China to defend Russia and we're off to the races with World War III. Of course, what Ukraine is doing to defend itself is to use weapons that are made by the United States, shipped to them from the United States, and the United States get to decide what they can use. This month, Joe Biden has decided that missiles that will go further into Russia can now be used by Ukraine to shoot into Russia. Now, again, the logic here is to try to weaken the Russian forces or cut off their capacity to go back into Russia, but still, is it not still an American weapon landing in Russian territory? Just because it wasn't fired by an American, how will Putin respond? I don't say this as a Putin apologist. He's the bad guy, right? But there has been an escalation where it's not just giving them money, it's giving them weapons and now giving them weapons to actually hit Russia with. And this is not a one-off. In fact, the Biden administration is now, currently this week, meeting with the UK's brand new Prime Minister, telling them, hey, you should do the same thing. So again, unpredictable, wrong, bad guy, Russia. How do they respond when weapons of the United States and the UK will be dropped into Russia? How will China respond? Of course, nothing to see here, right?